Okay, Rebecca's telling me that we're ready to go and we're live on the internet as well as with the Casper Regional Office. So welcome to the Casper public meeting. That's what the intent of this event is here today, and we actually we're going to try to do this in person, obviously in Casper, but because of the weather had to make a change of plans. So we appreciate those folks that made their way down to the Casper office today. You're really the primary audience, but we also, because of the weather, have made arrangements so that this is broadcast over the internet for those other folks that may want to tune in but not have to drive to the regional office. So we will go through this plan here today, and then we'll have some instructions at the end regarding how the methods that we'll use to solicit public input from those folks that are either on the internet or there in person in Casper. I do want to take an opportunity to welcome anybody that's watching on behalf of the Wyoming Game and Fish Commission, as well as Director Scott Talbot and the members of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. This is an opportunity today this is the first meeting in a series of, I think, 8, where we will provide information to the public regarding the details of the updated draft Wyoming Game and Fish Department's Grizzly Bear Management Plan. With that, I think we'll go ahead. This presentation today will come primarily from Dan Thompson, who's our large carnivore section supervisor. Dan is joining us from Lander today, and myself. I'm Brian Nesvik. I'm the Chief Game Warden and the Chief of the Wildlife Division for the department, and we're both excited to be here and excited to be a part of this process as we present the details of this draft plan. So first of all, if we want to go to the first slide, or am I controlling that? Okay. Go ahead. Sounds great. Advance it. Okay, so this first slide here outlines the major components of the draft Grizzly Bear Management Plan that we'll talk about here today. Go ahead. So first of all, I thought we'd start with just a little bit of history and background of where we've been with grizzly bear, the status of grizzly bears in our state over the last about 40 years. So the grizzly bear was listed in 1975 under the Endangered Species Act as threatened when populations were estimated to be potentially as low as 136 individuals in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Since then, there's been a lot of hard work that's gone into the development of a recovery plan, as well as executing that recovery plan and bringing the grizzly bear population to a point where all of the recovery criteria were met or exceeded by 2004, or some of them even earlier than that. So for those, many of you may remember that in 2007, the grizzly bear population in the greater Yellowstone was delisted, and a short time after that, a court determined that, or I guess I'll back up a little bit. First of all, the decision to delist by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service was challenged through the courts, and the primary challenges were with regards to adequate regulatory mechanisms, which are required by the Endangered Species Act before a species can be delisted, and the fact that the plaintiffs alleged that those regulatory mechanisms that were in place were not adequate to ensure that the grizzly bear population would remain recovered. And secondly, the plaintiffs challenged that white bark pine impacts were not adequately described in the Fish and Wildlife Service's decision to delist. The court ended up finding that there were, through a series, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but through a series of appeals, the courts did determine that adequate regulatory mechanisms did exist, but that the United States Fish and Wildlife Service did not adequately describe any potential impacts that may have occurred with regards to white bark pine declines in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So really what that did is, go ahead to the next, is that prompted the interagency grizzly bear study team to prepare and compile what was later termed the Food Synthesis Report. And really what the Food Synthesis Report did is it put together a myriad of peer-reviewed publications that demonstrated viability and recovery of the greater Yellowstone area grizzly bear population during a time when whitebark pine did decline in the ecosystem. This Food Synthesis Report, the service as well as the state feels addresses the concerns that were expressed by the court, and that it also is what prompted the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee as well as the subcommittee that's specifically charged with the Yellowstone ecosystem to support and vote to support delisting for this population of grizzly bear. So this rule was proposed recently in March of 2016 by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's out now for public comment. The recovery criteria, both demographic and habitat-based recovery criteria, as I mentioned earlier, have been met or exceeded for a number of years. So just as a matter of explanation, when we talk about delisting, and one of the prerequisites that the United States Fish and Wildlife Service has to demonstrate before they file a delisting rule, they have to basically show that these 5 factors listed on the screen here are addressed, and they have to address their analysis of those threats and in their draft delisting rule. And I won't go through each one of these, but obviously for the state of Wyoming, one of the focuses of the Grizzly Bear Management Plan is on Factor D, which are the regulatory mechanisms that the state either has in place now or will implement to ensure a continued grizzly bear, a recovered grizzly bear population into the future. So when I talk today about, and Dan talks today about regulatory mechanisms, really that's a fancy word that describes laws, statutes, regulations, formal agreements, management plans like the Wyoming Grizzly Bear Management Plan that are in place that address enforceable and executable plans and laws that will ensure a delisted population remains delisted and recovered. The other thing that you'll hear referenced today is the Greater Yellowstone Area Distinct Population Segment, and so it's important for everybody to understand what that acronym means, because we'll use it several times throughout this presentation. Basically what that means is that it's specific just to the Yellowstone area. It's specific just to that grizzly bear population. Many probably know that there are several different grizzly bear populations in the lower 48, and the grizzly bear population that we'll talk about today and throughout this plan, and the only one that exists in Wyoming, is the distinct population segment that is in the Greater Yellowstone area. So one of the things that has to be in place is as I've mentioned, is these regulatory mechanisms, and they must ensure that the Yellowstone bear population will continue to remain recovered. This plan is a draft, and it will replace the plan that was put into place the last time bears were delisted. This is an update, and it includes many of the new overarching frameworks that have been agreed to and developed by the department as within the parameters of federal delisting requirements. So when this is approved by our commission, it will provide the overarching framework and the guidance for the department to use as the department moves forward with grizzly bear management into the future. The important point of all of this is that at the end of the day, when the grizzly bear population is delisted, the department and the Game and Fish Commission will assume the primary responsibility for managing these animals throughout Wyoming, except for those areas that are within the boundaries of national parks and on tribal lands of the Wind River Reservation. Just a little bit of history on some of the laws and regulations that and when they were developed in Wyoming. So in one of the first set of game and fish codes that are referenced in the historical documents in 1899. There was no mention of grizzly bears, but in 1903 in the State Game Warden report, there was the first mention that we found historically that actually talks about when there was some regulation specific to grizzly bear populations in the state. And as you can see there, in 1937, both species of bear in Wyoming were classified as game animals, meaning that they required licenses and had seasons established for them. And then, like I said before, in 1975, the grizzly bear population in the Yellowstone area was listed as threatened. A couple of important current statutes that exist on the books and that have existed in Wyoming laws for a number of years are the statutes you see here on the screen. So they're important because it demonstrates that in Wyoming, grizzly bears are classified across the entire state as a trophy game animal, meaning that there are specific regulations that address their management, requiring things like if they're to be taken, the manners that they can be taken in, that define the parameters of take when bears are involved in human conflict, and also the requirement that if hunting seasons are to exist, that will ensure that there are hunting seasons and licenses required in order to engage in that activity. The Appendix 2 of the plan details some of the current regulations that are in place, as well as some of the statutes that are directly related to damage, and we're going to go into those some of those pending and potential regulations later on in this presentation. The other current statute and I've talked about this just a little bit, is that it directs the Commission to ensure that for trophy game animals that seasons and bag limits are established if hunting seasons are determined to be an appropriate management tool by the Commission. And it also directs the Commission to establish areas where trophy game animals may be taken. And as I indicated before, since grizzly bears are identified as and defined in Wyoming law as trophy game animals, this statute is very important for their, it's very applicable to their management. The other thing is that as I indicated, in order to take a grizzly bear in Wyoming, you have to have a license, similar to other trophy game species. Some of the boundaries that we'll talk about today, you see the blue outer line there that defines what I identified earlier as the Greater Yellowstone Area distinct population segment. You can see the shaded area that has hash marks in it, and that describes the 2014 grizzly bear distribution. You can see the Wind River Reservation that's highlighted in orange there by the orange outline. And important in some of the things that we're going to talk about today is the black line, the black solid line, which is, we'll refer to that many times today, and we're going to describe that, and that's the demographic monitoring area, and the acronym being the DMA. I think what you'll find as we talk through this is that while the distinct population segment is defined in a rather large geographic area there outlined in blue, the management topics that we will discuss today will be primarily focused on that area in the extreme northwest part of the state, where there's existing populations and distribution of grizzly bears, and around that area highlighted by the black line. So as I said, we would talk about the demographic monitoring area, and I'm going to ask Dan to help out a little bit here. And first of all, before we talk about what it is, have Dan kind of define how the demographic monitoring area was developed. So please go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, Brian. Can you hear me? Yep. So the DMA is really important. Newer Grizzly Bear Management. We developed several years ago, and it was done so in order to maintain consistency with how we monitor the grizzly bear population within that distinct population segment. The one thing that we were seeing as we were documenting more mortalities outside of the DMA that were counting against some of those thresholds, whereas we weren't counting bears that added to the population estimate outside in that area. So this concept was developed by the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team, which is made up of managers and biologists from multiple agencies, the states, the USGS, and all people that have been working with grizzly bears for multiple decades, quite honestly. And so this was based, it was actually a more realistic boundary based on biologically and socially suitable habitat. And so we went through and modeled what was considered biologically suitable habitat, and actually put a smoothing parameter so it was a contiguous line across the ecosystem. And so basically that way, this is an area that we can monitor and manage for grizzly bears that makes sense for both bears and people. And I think the important part that I alluded to earlier is that the things that we're going to be talking about, Brian's going to be talking about recovery criteria here shortly. The annual population estimates and the mortality limits that we'll be discussing all apply within that demographic monitoring area. And outside that area, we would have more flexibility outside of the demographic monitoring area. But it's important that we're still going to document grizzly bear activities throughout the state. It's something that we're going to keep track of. It's just that the area within is where things would count towards those recovery and toward what we consider a recovered population. And I think I'll turn it back to you, Brian.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So as Dan highlighted, I think the major takeaway with the demographic monitoring area that we will talk about throughout this entire population, or this entire presentation, is that the major parameters and framework that we're going to discuss is focused on that area within the black line, within the DMA, and the area outside of the DMA. The state has more flexibility, and as Dan indicated, bears there that are part of the mortality information, bears that die outside of that line are not counted against the population, or against those mortality limits, whereas bears that die within the line do. Likewise, the population estimate will be developed from information and bears that are that occupy the areas within the line, not those bears that occupy the area outside of the line. So this is just an overview of the major portions of the Draft Grizzly Bear Management Plan that we're going to talk about today. Dan and I are going to split this up. I'll start off by talking about the adaptive management criteria. So basically there are three major grizzly bear life history parameters that are monitored as recovery criteria, and so they're really focused on three components of grizzly bear life history, and those are, first of all, ensuring that there is sufficient reproduction to offset any mortalities and to ensure that there's population viability. Secondly, it's important to ensure that the reproductive segments of the population are located throughout the entire demographic monitoring area, and especially that area in the very that's called the primary conservation area on the map that we looked at earlier, and so the core of the population, and that reproductive females are distributed throughout that. And then lastly, the recovery criteria are focused on ensuring that annual human-caused mortality does not threaten the recovered population. So the first recovery criteria, and these are listed in the Game and Fish draft plan. However, these are not developed by the Game and Fish. These are recommendations proposed by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. These two are out for public comment along with the draft delisting rule, because these are changed recovery criteria based on new science and updated information. So if you remember on the previous slide, we talked about the first component, grizzly bear life history component, that is considered by recovery criteria is ensuring that there are enough bears in the population to ensure there's reproduction that will offset any mortality in the population. And that's why recovery criteria 1 indicates that there has to be at least 500 bears in the population in order to meet that recovery criteria. Secondly, you remember I talked about distribution of the reproductive segments of the population being distributed across the entire Greater Yellowstone area, and so that's what this recovery criteria ensures is that we'll show a picture here in a minute of what the bear management units look like, and in fact we'll go to that now. These are the bear management units that are germane to recovery criteria number 2, which says that 16 of these 18 units have to be occupied by females with cubs. And again, what that ensures is that we have the reproductive portion of the population or component of the population equally, or not, I shouldn't say equally, but distributed throughout the entire primary conservation area. And then the last recovery criteria is focused on mortality and ensuring that mortality is controlled to ensure that the bear population remains recovered. This recovery criteria really is probably the largest change in the new updated recovery criteria, and really what it defines is a range within which the grizzly bear population will be managed to at least within. So go ahead to the next. And really this table is a table that defines the adaptive management framework that mortality will be managed within, and this is a floor or an at least to within these parameters that are listed on the screen. So really what recovery criteria 3 says is that if the grizzly bear population is below 674 bears, that mortality limits will be extremely conservative. And then if the grizzly bear population is above that, up to a level of 747, that there will be additional flexibility and it won't be managed as conservatively. And then lastly, when the grizzly bear population is over that higher number of 747, mortality limits will be more liberal. Those numbers were developed based on the average population throughout the years of 2002 to 2014. And this was a period when the growth in the population slowed. It continued to grow, but it did not grow at the same rate. And so that's how these parameters were identified. And basically 674 is that average, and the lower end of the 95th percent confidence interval is 600 bears, and the higher end is 747, and that's where those numbers were derived. It's very technical, but this part of the demographic recovery criteria really requires rigorous and science that helps to define how these mortality limits are applied. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Dan, and he's going to talk about where the grizzly bear population in northwest Wyoming is in relation to those 3 recovery criteria, as well as several other components of the plan. Go ahead, Dan.
Thanks, Brian. Excuse me. First, we'll start with recovery criterion 1. As you can see, the red line there is that 500 level, and we've been above that since 2002. And this is for the Greater Yellowstone area, obviously. And if you look, since 2007, we've actually been above that 675 that Brian mentioned earlier as well. So the one thing that Brian also talked about was the change in the trajectory. We did see the population growth rate slow somewhat, but based on that food synthesis report and multiple peer-reviewed articles that came out after that, everything suggested that any slowing of that trajectory was due to density dependence, which you'd expect as a population increases in density. Do you want to go to the next slide, please? This is the distributional recovery criterion. You can see that we've met or exceeded that since 1999. So those are females with young in those 18 bear management units. And if you want to go to the next slide, please, I think this gives a very illustrative perception of that. These are actually verified grizzly bear females with young. And on the left, you see from 2001 to 2006. And it was fairly limited. Those numbers and those observations were fairly limited to those initial 18 bear management units within that recovery zone. But what we've seen since that time is we maintained that distribution within that core area, but we've also seen an increase in that distribution of breeding grizzly bears outside of that recovery zone or primary conservation area through time. And I'm going to talk about these separately as we look at these as separate sex and age cohorts of the population. We talk about independent age females, we'll talk about females a lot because they're the breeding segment of the population. But if you want to click on that one more time, you'll see that dashed line in there. That's what the mortality threshold has been since 2007. So the population has been above 675 since that time frame. And for independent age females, which are females 2 years or older, we have not exceeded that recovery criterion for more than 3 years ever. For independent age males as well, now we've actually seen an increase in survival of independent age males through time. Females have stayed static over the last multiple decades. We've actually seen an increase in male survival. And so what we see as far as that goes, we have not reached that mortality threshold since 2007 for independent age males. We've obviously never exceeded that for a 3-year period. Now you won't see an actual figure related to dependent young, and that's because we've never exceeded annually those mortality limits for dependent young part of the population. And just an indicator, we wanted to kind of portray some of the changes we've seen with human-caused grizzly bear mortalities. Obviously, we really look closely at this. One thing that's remained fairly static is those illegal types of mortalities. They're really, I think it really shows a commitment by people living and recreating in grizzly bear country that we haven't seen an increase of illegal mortalities despite an increase in the population. What we have documented as far as an increase in trend is self-defense mortalities of people where they were attacked by a grizzly bear or acted in self-defense, as well as an increase in management removals. And those are in proportion to the increase in the population that we documented through time. And so one of the things, excuse me, that we talk about throughout the management plan is occupancy. And we have definitely documented increased distribution and occupancy of grizzly bears throughout time, throughout Wyoming, and in many cases beyond that demographic monitoring area. The pictures below are actually from Park County. You can see there's a situation with bears that are actually expanding into some of these areas that are very difficult from a management standpoint. The female with the young on the right, that's actually on the highway north of Cody, which is them moving to the east side of the highway in an area that we had never seen a breeding population of bears for hundreds of years, actually. And so we're going to go through several slides here and just to show you that increased distribution. And this is based on a technique that was developed by Dan Bjornley within the Wyoming Game and Fish Department that takes all verified grizzly bear locations and actually plots them to come up with an annual distribution that's based on the metrics that are verified, and it's in peer-reviewed literature. It allows us to actually quantify that change in distribution through time. So you see in 1980, bears were limited to basically within that recovery zone. By if you want to switch, by 1990, they filled up that recovery zone, and they're starting to move beyond that. The little black bear symbols are bears that we have verified locations of, but basically those are primarily outliers. We didn't consider that actual distribution. Next slide, please. So by 2000, excuse me, we've moved beyond that, the recovery zone primary conservation area, and we're starting to fill up the habitat more. By 2010, we've seen a larger shift to the point where we've seen an increase in distribution actually beyond that demographic monitoring area and that Cody front and along the Owl Creeks and into the Wyoming range. And if you want to click one more slide, this is where we're at in 2014. We'll be putting together 2015's distribution here very shortly. One thing that we've seen is since 2004, we've seen greater than 40% increase in distribution of grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone area. Now this next slide is another illustration of the increase in density. So you're going to see a series of slides that move through time, and there's a bunch of grid cells that you'll see, and those grid cells are 14 by 14 kilometers. As they get darker, the bear density increases. So by 2000, we're seeing outside the DMA. So we have this through 2012. This is based on 870 individual home ranges of grizzly bears, back calculated and forward calculated. And it gives you an index just to show that while we've maintained that high density in the core, we've really seen an expansion of density throughout Wyoming. And back to you, Brian.
Right. Okay, so we're now going to kind of move on. We've looked now at what the recovery criteria are, where we're at in relation to those recovery criteria, and the current status of the grizzly bear population in Wyoming. And now we're going to move to some of the major components of this grizzly bear management plan. And Dan's going to take the bulk of this, but I wanted to start it off by talking about kind of in general the Game and Fish's commitment to this point to grizzly bear recovery. And one of the things that we've had in place for quite some time is a work unit, a group of folks, a team within the department that is focused on large carnivore management, all of the large carnivores, but in particular grizzly bears. And really within this large carnivore section, we have all grizzly bear experts. All of them are cross-trained to deal with multiple species and to address all aspects of grizzly bear management and monitoring, as well as the other large carnivore species. We also, within our department, train our field biologists and game wardens to deal with certain aspects of grizzly bear management, to include data collection, conflict management, trapping, relocation, those kind of things. And so the point here is that we have within the department now trained experts that have been engaged in grizzly bear management and recovery for decades, and any transition from federal to state management will be seamless. So Dan now is going to talk a little bit about specific components of the plan related to population monitoring and management. Go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, Brian. First of all, yeah, we'll talk a little bit about population monitoring and management. Now, obviously, we could talk an entire presentation just about this component, but I think it's important to highlight this, that we capture grizzly bears, and we capture grizzly bears for monitoring and conflict management purposes, but they both provide insight into what's going on with this population. Captured grizzly bears and radio marked animals provide insight into survival, reproduction, movements, habitat use. We look at body condition from every captured bear, and then obviously we can look at abundance. And all these different things that we collect from every bear that we've ever handled are what is used to demonstrate this recovered grizzly bear population that we see in the greater Yellowstone area. Excuse me. Earlier we talked about that DMA. We have grizzly bear observation areas that are designed to reflect the boundaries of that DMA. in order to maintain consistency. We do grizzly bear observation flights every year, every summer. We've done those for decades now, and it allows us to provide insight into that distribution, but also the information is used in population abundance and, again, looking at the reproductive segment. And grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone area are unique in certain areas in that they're fairly visible from the air. So certain areas, especially in the core of the population, we're able to see them from the air and document them, use those numbers as far as and to model the population. And one thing that has been interesting is through time, as that bear population has increased in distribution and abundance, we've seen a shift, not a shift, but an increase in actual those ground observations, especially of females with young. Again, we monitor all forms of mortality for grizzly bears in Wyoming, and this is something, again, I mentioned earlier that we take very seriously. We will manage human-caused mortality to assure that overall mortality limits for the DMA are not exceeded. This is something that we can do through multiple avenues. The bear on the left that you see there was actually a very old male that we caught. You can see the collar there. He was actually killed by other bears. We were starting to see that a little more in the population. And we obviously are looking into the different grizzly bear foods. We monitor those. One thing that we found out through our exhaustive analysis of what bears eat in the past over that food synthesis report, we know that bears are extremely opportunistic. They're very adaptable, and they find foods to make sure that they're maintaining adequate condition. Brian, I'll let you cover this part.
All right, so we'll take here a few minutes to talk a little bit about the potential of hunting. And one of the things that is important to note about the current draft of this Grizzly Bear Management Plan is that it does offer as a option and a management tool the use of hunting to manage this population, as we do with other species in the state of large carnivore. While it offers it as an option, it is not directive in nature, and it doesn't finalize the Commission's decision one way or the other on when and if hunting seasons will be established. That is a Commission decision that will come after this plan has been approved and finalized. Any potential harvest objectives and population objectives are certainly the purview of the Wyoming Game and Fish Commission and will be contemplated by the Commission, discussed with the Commission, with the public, and the Commission will make that decision on whether they want to enact hunting seasons. Now, one of the things that we did want to go through is as we developed what we're going to talk about later, that's dubbed the three-state memorandum of agreement, and as we worked with United States Fish and Wildlife Service to talk about post-delisted grizzly bear management in Wyoming, they were interested in what regulations and laws were currently on the books, and also what regulations and laws may be considered down the road. And so I'm going to take some time to run through some of those potential and existing regulations that are either in place now or may be proposed down the road, depending on whether the Commission decides to move forward with a hunting season or not. So first of all, any plan to conduct a hunting season, regardless of scale, will include requirements to ensure mortality is within those demographic recovery criteria, and that those recovery criteria continued to be met or exceeded, so that we ensure there is a recovered grizzly bear population. Obviously, it is not, at least from our perspective, in the state's best interest or in the grizzly bear's best interest to be placed back on the endangered species list, and Wyoming is committed to ensuring that doesn't happen when this management transitions to the state. The other thing is that we will consider, obviously, as we do with other species, proposing to the Commission, if they decide there's going to be hunting, the prohibition of take outside of designated areas and seasons. There would be, regardless of whether the the hunting season was within or outside of the demographic monitoring area. The current and potential future regulations would propose that hunting be regulated as other large carnivore species, trophy game species in our state are managed now. Additionally, any potential hunting seasons would be approved, as I stated, through the Game and Fish Commission and through a public process, as we just like we do with big game season setting, for example, that's coming up here in the near future. We will certainly consider, as we and most likely the Commission will seriously consider the notion of prohibiting the take of any grizzly bear with dependent young at side, and that's important to bring up now because that was actually even put into the draft delisting rule by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service as a requirement. And so regardless of whether there's a hunting season or not, the Commission is going to have to consider that particular component. And it is important, I think, to note also that currently black bear hunting, for example, prohibits the take of any black bear that has dependent young at side. Lastly, those mortality limits that we've discussed, if we were to exceed those through either hunting or through management removals, we would propose that those mortalities would be adjusted the following year to account for the amount that was exceeded in the mortality limits. Some other regulations that are important, and many of these are consistent with the hunting of other trophy game species, would be reporting of harvest to the Game and Fish Department in a specified amount of time. The requirement to present the actual animal for inspection to the department so that certain biological information can be collected from the animal. The other thing that we've certainly discussed, and it's been contemplated for many years in our state, is that if there was a hunting season promulgated by the Commission, that it might be wise to at least have the discussion and consider a proposal to require some kind of a course for those few folks that had that opportunity, excuse me, to hunt, to have some kind of a grizzly bear, excuse me, identification and management course to help hunters identify and know, maybe potentially help them identify between male and female bears. And then lastly, there certainly will be a discussion if there is a hunting season about requiring bear hunters to carry bear spray while hunting. Obviously, the likelihood of an encounter with a bear when you're hunting one is increased. Now I'll turn it back over to Dan to talk about some of the components of research and monitoring.
Thank you. As we go through this too, I wanted to point out that the format of this presentation follows the similar format of our management plan. So if you've actually read it, you can see that we're following the way it was written in this presentation. As far as research and monitoring, the Wyoming Game and Fish has been heavily involved in all monitoring and new research with this population through time. This population allows a very unique opportunity to look at changes through time, as we've seen a population that was literally on the brink to the point where we're documenting density dependence in the population. Obviously, we always want to continue to evaluate and develop more precise techniques to evaluate and estimate abundance and trend of the population. That's critical so that we can, in the future, evaluate how our management is working for that population. And so we have the ability to do that through time. One thing that we'll see, sorry, can you go back? We're also going to be looking at interactions with ungulate populations, with other carnivores through time. With the increased abundance and distribution of grizzly bears, we also want to see what other changes may be occurring on the landscape. And then again, obviously, this is one of the most heavily studied wildlife populations on Earth. And so we can look at those things from what's changing in those demographics when there was very few on the landscape to where we're at now, and also exciting to be able to look at what may be changing into the future. Habitat and land management. Obviously, the department has no direct authority to manage habitat except on commission-owned lands. Within that demographic monitoring area, the primary land management agency is the U.S. Forest Service. The 6 national forests within the GYA have committed to maintain those secure grizzly bear habitat standards that were developed in 1998. All plan revisions include standards that ensure that habitat will be conserved in order to maintain and demonstrate a recovered grizzly bear population within that distinct population segment. Again, we work very closely with the U.S. Forest Service on multiple aspects, and we'll obviously advocate a maintenance of those roadless areas where they currently exist. And then, as we do now, we work very closely with land management agencies as far as securing attractants, things like that, that are going to reduce the potential for future conflicts. We're working with the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, and also with private people, private landholders, in order to try to really work to make sure that we're providing secure attractants. Which leads right into our conflict management program. This is something we take very seriously as a section and as an agency. It's a vital component of large carnivore management. The department has been managing grizzly bear conflicts since the 1970s, literally. And it went from a few people dealing with it to the crew that we have now. As the population has grown in abundance and distribution, we have responded with increased manpower and resources. It's very critical that we can respond to any type of a human grizzly bear conflict immediately. And to give you an idea, again, this is going to be several slides through time. The yellow dots on the map are confirmed grizzly bear human conflicts. This first slide shows through 1990, and this is just Wyoming, the dots you'll see. You'll see most of those conflicts were limited to that core area. By 2000, as the population increased and through 2000, we see that increase by 2010. As you can see here, the black line again is that demographic monitoring area. We've actually seen conflicts spill over that area of suitable habitat and conflicts occurring outside that area. And again, we've just seen that increase through time. So again, that just means we're going to respond quickly and do everything that we can to reduce those conflicts. Now, these are chronological through time. We've seen that increase in distribution. We have seen a tapering off in the core area, which demonstrates a commitment of those people that live and recreate in grizzly bear habitats to try to reduce those conflicts. One of the more vital components that probably doesn't get brought up as much is our information and education programs in order to educate the public, people that live in Wyoming, and especially the people that visit, about what it means to have grizzly bears on the landscape. So as far back as 1991, we launched educational efforts in order to reduce conflicts and educate the public regarding grizzly bears. In 2005, it was more formalized into a Bearwise community program. This actually started west of Cody. And as that program grew, and we had a lot of success, I mean, it's really on the ground work, working with the public. We actually rebranded that effort to make a broader context to what we call Bearwise Wyoming right now. Again, this is a very proactive form of a component of the overall management program, but it's really critical to try to reduce any issues that we might have conflict-wise in a preemptive fashion. And so you can see on the right there, that's Dusty Lasser. He's our Bearwise community coordinator. He's actively engaged with the local public, livestock producers, pretty much anyone that will listen. We're working with. We're really trying to do anything we can in a proactive fashion to deal with grizzly bears and grizzly bear conflicts on the landscape.
Okay, and I'm going to take it from here. Thank you, Dan. One of the sections that's fairly short but important in the plan is the section on law enforcement, and certainly the department in the draft plan and as is illustrated with other species has a commitment to enforcing all laws and regulations that it's charged with enforcing, and the grizzly bear in a delisted status would be no different, and the department intends to continue, and I say continue because we've been involved in law enforcement up to this point with grizzly bears, and intends to continue to work and to investigate reported violations, to work with local prosecutors to adjudicate those violations in an appropriate way. Kind of the last major component here, I guess next to the last major component that I think is important to talk about is an attachment to the plan, an appendix, the first one, and it's called the Tri-State MOA. And this is very, very important because obviously this grizzly bear population spans 3 states, and these recovery criteria and consequently the management of the grizzly bear is important in all 3 of those states. And what this Tri-State Memorandum of Agreement does is it really solidifies the commitment by all 3 states to work cooperatively to allocate discretionary mortality and to ensure that the recovery criteria continue to be met. This Tri-State Memorandum of Agreement also formalizes a continued commitment to work with the federal land management agencies as well as the national parks to discuss discretionary mortality and share information on an annual basis. This, along with the plan, will go to the Commission at the same time. And again, this is a very important component, I think, to the Wyoming Grizzly Bear Management Plan that was not in place before, but really important this time. Lastly, you know, one thing that I don't think anybody can criticize the state of Wyoming for is their incredible investment of over $40 million now into the recovery of grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And I think that this plan, as well as the move by the service to delist the bear again, is really a move that honors that effort by Wyoming's people to make such an investment in grizzly bear management and recovery. You know, hopefully we're able to find efficiencies and potentially continue to manage grizzly bears with the same amount of the same budget that we've used to this point. But anyway, I don't see that this plan advocates anything but continued commitment to provide funding for grizzly bear management in Wyoming. So in conclusion, I think there's probably 4 major points that that I would just highlight again here at the end of the presentation. First of all, that this is definitely a success story, a wildlife management conservation success story, where the grizzly bear population in northwest Wyoming and parts of Idaho and Montana certainly was at a far at a far lower level than it is now, and due to the efforts of a lot of different folks, including government and non-governmental agency, as well as citizens of the 3 states, have worked hard to recover this population, and it's a heck of a story that really reflects the values that that folks in our state hold for wildlife. I think the other thing is that this plan definitely aims to ensure that we have a continued viable, healthy, and recovered grizzly bear population into the future under state management, and that the 3 states are going to work together and synchronize their efforts and coordinate grizzly bear management. I think it goes without saying that grizzly bears and other wildlife species don't know where political and jurisdictional boundaries are, and it's important for those 3 states to agree to and commit to work together on those issues. So just a quick overview of the timeline and the process for folks to provide comments. First of all, we're now, this is the first of, I think, 7 or 8 public meetings that we will hold to gather public feedback and to present this plan and share the information and the major points in the plan. We are going to provide this presentation on our website so folks can view it if they can't make one of those meetings. We will also be live streaming again over the internet during the Cheyenne meeting on April 7th, and so that folks can view that from anywhere in the world virtually, that they can get connected to the World Wide Web. The comments are due to Cheyenne by the 14th of April, and then we're going to put effort into and get those comments synthesized, analyzed, and then consider where appropriate we need to make changes to the plan that we're going to present to the Commission. And that final briefing to the Commission and our ask of them to approve the plan will occur on May 11th back in Casper, and we'll ask the Commission at that time to approve the Grizzly Bear Management Plan as well as the Tri-State Memorandum of Agreement. Comments are able to be submitted in a lot of different ways. You can go online and do that. You can come to public meetings. You can send your comments by mail to the address on the screen, as well as you can submit them, when you're at a public meeting, you can submit them in writing. You can see there's a couple ways that, in the interest of being able to give these comments the attention that they deserve, that we cannot accept comments, and that's email, fax, or telephone. So we ask that folks take the time to do it in one of the formats that's described here above. And with that, as I stated at the beginning, really this is the public meeting for Casper, and so we are going to take questions from any of the folks that showed up there in the Casper office. Those of you that are on the internet, you're welcome to provide comments electronically or come to one of our other meetings, and we'll be glad to hear what those are. And I think what we'll do, Brian, is as we have questions there, I'll start with, I'll kind of take a shot at it initially and figure out if Dan's going to answer it or if I'm going to answer it, if that works for you.
Yeah. You guys are here, if you have any questions, ask away.
Yep, you're right up front, so feel free. And Brian, just let us know if you can't hear any of the questions. We'll have him repeat that. So, gentlemen, feel free.
How many tags are we thinking of opening up for hunting?
Okay, so I think what I heard there was how many tags are we talking about as far as hunting?
That is correct.
Okay, so really we're at a position where we're not that far down the road. We can't even we haven't even looked at how many tags would potentially be issued if the Commission decided to have a hunting season. Those are the kind of discussions that would happen when we actually established seasons. They would be based on the latest science and the most up-to-date population estimate, as well as the most up-to-date other things that have to go into making that calculation. For example, one thing that has to be considered in that calculation is how many bears were removed from the population for human conflict reasons, as one example. Other mortalities like bears that might have been hit on the highway, those kind of things all have to be considered before the department would be prepared to make a recommendation to the Commission. And I'll add one more thing on that. I think that this discussion with the public and the Commission about grizzly bear hunting is probably, there will certainly be some talk about that over this next year, but the Commission's going to consider a regulation that will have kind of the overarching management framework in it over the summer, and with a final meeting in September, and then they'll consider the question of hunting seasons and hunt areas and all those kind of things, allocation of tags after the bear is delisted, which we hope will be at the end of this calendar year. So really the discussions that we're talking about would probably be happening about a year from now.
Great question. Anything else on your mind?
Yeah, I have a question. The Fish and Wildlife Service draft plan addresses some closures of grazing allotments, but I saw that in your management plan there wasn't really, you didn't address that much. Is there going to be any changes in the management of grazing allotments in problem areas?
Yeah, I don't think that, yeah, you're right. There is nothing in our plan that addresses closing of grazing allotments, and that's actually not within the Game and Fish Department's purview to close those. That's done by land management agencies like the Forest Service. I can tell you that there has been in the primary conservation area, which is that real core area of the population, there's been no net gain of any grazing allotments there, and there have been continued grazing allotments outside of that line inside the demographic monitoring area. During that period of time when those allotments have been active, the grizzly bear population has continued to increase. So I don't see that the department would ever be in a position that we would be recommending that to the land management agencies.
Okay.
In the sense of the safety issues with hunting grizzly bears, is it going to be similar to, like, say, how Alaska runs it, where you have a guide with you, or how are we going to be going about that?
Though I think what I heard was is if Wyoming would be considering requirement of a guide to be able, to accompany a person who was hunting grizzly bears.
That is correct.
So I can tell you at this point, we internally haven't had any discussion like that. We'd certainly be open to comment from the public if there was some, folks from the public that wanted us to consider that. I would say, kind of off the cuff that, we haven't done that with any other species, and I think we'd have to have a fairly compelling reason before we were going to recommend something like that to the commission. And I think that one of the things that's illustrated in some of the information that Dan presented is that Wyoming people have learned to recreate around grizzly bears and to be able to do it safely. We've had an increase in conflicts, but at the same time, the grizzly bear population has continued to do well, and in fact, it's continued to grow and expand outside of the boundaries of the demographic monitoring area. So I think our folks, for the most part, have learned how to be safe and recreate around them and carry bear spray and carry something to protect themselves and those kind of things.
Anything else?
Are we doing anything maybe for congressional to seal this with a legislative deal instead of maybe just coming out with this? Because I know as soon as we pass this plan, we're going to be attacked by Wild Earth Guardians and all the left. So I think the best choice would be for us to get with the legislature too, to have them back this plan, set it in stone. That way we're not bogged down in the court system.
Yeah, so I think that's a relevant comment, and I think that right now a commission regulation carries the same weight as a weight, if you will, I guess, as a state statute. It's still law, and I think that certainly the legislature may consider adopting some of these things into statute, but at least from our perspective, I don't know that it would necessarily gain anything for us. I think that the litigation that we all expect will come will most likely focus on the actual decision to delist more than it will Wyoming's Grizzly Bear Management Plan. Now that certainly could come down the road, but I think initially that litigation won't necessarily address our plan or the commission's plan. What else, gentlemen? That's all I can see is gentlemen. I hope there's not any ladies in there other than Kendra.
The only other question I was going to ask was, basically on the cost of the licenses, is that pretty much set in stone already, or is that just kind of like a price that we've just kind of thrown out there? Because I've seen somewhere where it was talking about $6,000 for non-residents and $600 for resident hunters.
Yeah, excellent question. That is actually one of the components of this that is set in statute. All license fees are set by the Wyoming legislature for, or I shouldn't say all license fees, game and fish license fees are set by the legislature, and that is in statute. And so in order to change that, it would require a change to the statute through the legislature.
So
It is 600 for residents, 6,000 for non-residents currently.
right. So it could be subject to change then.
It could, yes.
Okay.
All right, any other questions?
I think you've answered everything that they brought to the meeting there, Brian, so we really appreciate this.
Hey, you bet. Hey, thank you guys for braving the roads and coming out here. We probably would have had a few more folks there if it wasn't such cruddy weather, but we appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
All right, you guys have a good day.
Take care.